Welcome to the home stretch with regards to World War II. So far in our unit of World War II, we looked at the rise of dictators. We've talked about, ooh, that is not where I want to go. Hold on, let's try this one more time. We've looked at the rise of dictators. We talked about Stalin, we talked about Mussolini, we talked about Hitler, we talked about the leaders in Japan, Hirohito and Tojo. We talked about Hitler's rise to power and the act of German aggression. We talked briefly about the Spanish Civil War. We said the United States stays out of it. We practice neutrality. We talked about the good neighbor policy, which was how we said we were going to treat Latin America better. Um, then we talked about the rise of the war in Europe, from Hitler wanting to take over the Sudetenland, to the Munich Conference, to the Act of Appeasement, to the Non-Aggression Pact, to the invasion of Poland, which is a short-term cause of the World War II in Europe. We mentioned the bombing of Britain. We talked about the Axis and the Allied powers. We talked about how the United States was really not neutral, even though we claimed to be, with the Neutrality Acts, with Cash and Carry, with the Selective Service Act, with Lend-Lease, us being the arsenal for democracy, the Atlantic Charter or the Atlantic Compromise. We talked about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which gets the United States involved in World War II. Then we talked about the war on the home front with regards to women, women serving in the military, women working in the factories. We talked about Rosie the Riveter. We talked about minorities in the war, from Mexican Americans, the Bracero program. So please pay attention to this. The Bracero program was a program that was started, and that brought in Mexicans from Mexico to come and work in the farm industry in the United States, because we had lost so many farm workers due to the war. And that is, we'll talk about that more later on, but just make sure you know what the Bracero program is. We talked about getting the economy ready, War Production Board, Victory Gardens, rations, Servicemen's Readjustment Act, Second Great Migration, the Double V, Korematsu versus the U.S., and internment camps. The United States decides to focus on Germany first. We have the Battle of the Atlantic. We have the Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point battle in the European theater of the war. We've done the soft underbelly plan. We did the fact that Germany wouldn't allow Italy to surrender. We talked about D-Day, the invasion of the coast of France, and the idea to free France and then move in so that Germany is being squeezed from all sides. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last attempt to keep the Allies out of Germany. Hitler declares suicide. Hitler commits suicide. FDR dies. Truman takes over. We have VE Day. The war ends in Europe. Then we focused on the war in the Pacific. Remember, everything going on at the same time. We're just looking at it separately. The United States loses their island holdings. We lose the Philippines. That's the last big island chain that we lose. General Douglas MacArthur promises that he will return. We have the Battle of Coral Sea, which is to keep Japan out of Australia. The turning point battle of the Pacific theater is the Battle of Midway, and from that point on, Japan is fighting a defensive war rather than an offensive war, with America and our allied help, mainly Australia, coming to take back the land that Japan had taken that was ours. We call that island hopping. First battle was Battle of Guadalcanal, and then we move around in the circle. And when we left off, the last thing that we had was the two islands directly outside of Japan, and that is Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And by this point here, we're in 45. The war's getting ready to end in Europe, and Japan's becoming somewhat nervous because they realize that these battles, these two islands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, need to be held at all costs, because once those were gone, if the Americans took them, they could use those with which to launch an attack into Japan. And so Japan digs in very fiercely in order to hold on to Okinawa and Iwo Jima. So from the Philippines, America moves to Iwo Jima. We needed to take the base in order to fly out bombers. Japan heavily defended the island. They had almost 21,000 troops. It is a fierce, fierce, fierce battle. In the end, 6,000 Americans do die. That's the greatest number in the Pacific, is the battle in Iwo Jima, but only 200 Japanese survive. The Japanese casualties are massive, and it becomes clear that the Americans aren't quitting, that we are coming, and we offer numerous attempts and efforts to get Japan to quit, to just say, look, you can't win. The war's ending in Europe. Hitler's gone, Mussolini's gone, you're the last one, Hirohito and Tojo, let's just end this. It doesn't need to keep going on. But it does. And the battle for Okinawa is Japan's last defense. They order almost 2,000 kamikaze attacks. They sink 30 American ships. They damage 300 more. They kill 5,000. The invasion starts in April and it ends in June. So at this point, the war in Europe is over. We're only fighting the war in the Pacific. While we lose 8,000 Americans, almost 8,000 Americans, 110,000 Japanese die. And this begins to see what would have happened if America invaded Japan. Japan, look at the loss of life you're willing to sacrifice if America comes. You don't want this to happen. And even more so, the American concern was, we don't want to lose any more American soldiers. But Japan absolutely refused to surrender. In fact, they were now bolstering up and trying to reinvigorate the Japanese people to get ready for an attack on Japan. And so the issue really is, what do we do from here? And the question before Truman is, we have a couple of options. Option number one, we can invade Japan and we'll win, but the loss of American soldiers is estimated to be almost a million American lives to invade Japan, to bring Japan to its knees, and to win the war in the Pacific. And Truman doesn't know if he's willing to sacrifice that many American lives. He doesn't know that the American people are willing to sacrifice that many American lives. It's been proven that we can't really rely on our allies. We had asked the Soviet Union, and they had promised to send us aid and to help us in the Pacific, but so far they haven't really developed. They haven't followed through with that. That's one of the things that will go on our list to after World War II about why we're mad at the Soviet Union. We understand that France and Great Britain can't. Australia's been helping out as best they could, but we really felt like this would be again, a major American-led attack. So the other option that's presented to him is something that America had been working on for quite a while, and it was known as the Manhattan Project. It's led by J. Robert Oppenheimer. Only 600,000 Americans were involved, which makes it sound like that's a lot of people, but the varying degree to what people knew what was going on with the Manhattan Project, it was super, super secret, and even people involved didn't know everything. You didn't know all the pieces of the puzzle. What had been discovered by physicists was that you could take an atom and you could split an atom in half. You could split the nucleus of an atom in half, and that released a ton of energy. And we were really interested in how that worked and how that could be used. So the brightest scientific minds of the day, including Albert Einstein, were involved within the Manhattan Project. And what came out of the Manhattan Project was, if you do this all at once and you have a whole bunch of unstable atoms and you drop them, it releases a massive nuclear explosion, which we really didn't understand. And I will show you in class test footage of us practicing around with dropping an atomic bomb. It was sort of like we got the biggest super soaker gun that you could ever get, and we were playing around with how it worked, but we had no idea, nor did we really respect or appreciate the massive dangerous effects of playing around with radiation and exposing people to radiation and nuclear fallout. We tested several bombs in our own desert because, no one's there. It can't be that bad, but yet it can. And we tested the first one in July of 1945. So this is my favorite. If you look at this picture, it always looks like a clown to me. Like, here's his ears, here's his face open wide, here's his nose, and here is his eyes. Super creepy. When an atomic bomb is dropped, there is obviously the initial impact and the destruction of the bomb and the blast that goes out. But this cloud up here that comes up and that can be carried for miles and miles and miles is a radiation cloud. Exposure to radiation causes all sorts of really negative effects, cancer including one of them as a long-term effect, but things like making your skin melt off, that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of debate. And in the end, Truman decides to end the war once and for all by dropping what we thought was only going to be one atomic bomb on Japan. It ends up being 2 because Japan doesn't want to listen. In fact, and there was a lot of thing about what's called collateral damage. That's when in war you have deaths that are not related to other soldiers. And we did drop leaflets over Hiroshima to let them know that, hey, you probably want to leave. We are getting ready to do something really, really bad. If you're a citizen, you need to get out. We're not after attacking you. We're trying to get your government to stop war. And the plane that drops the atomic bomb is called the Enola Gay. Enola Gay. And the atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, is dropped August 6, 1945. The boat, the USS Indianapolis, that was tasked with delivering the atomic bomb to the plane to where they were going to fly out from. Interestingly enough, it was a super secret mission, and after it delivered the bomb, it was torpedoed by a Japanese vessel. The vessel didn't know that it had the atomic bomb on them. It was just they were just torpedoing an American ship. So the bomb's dropped on Hiroshima. It is massively devastating, but Japan doesn't quit. And so we drop another one. It's called Fat Man on August 9th, 1945. And by September 2nd, Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan, on board the USS Missouri, surrenders, and that ends the war in the Pacific. So the war in Europe ends in April. The war in the Pacific, or VJ Day, victory in Japan, we had VE Day, we have VJ Day, is in September. And at that point, World War II finally comes to a close. This is just showing you different footage, people in the fallout from the atomic bomb. Weird things that managed to stand even after the dropping of the atomic bomb. So after the war, there's a massive rebuilding effort. General Douglas MacArthur is put in charge of rebuilding Japan and reorganizing the Japanese government. We end up feeling really bad about the whole atomic bomb situation, and so we do a lot to help rebuild Japan. And Japan ends up writing a constitution similar to the United States. It's seen as a real success story. The Yalta Conference is in the Soviet Union, and Stalin, Truman, and Churchill meet and talk. What's interesting is that Truman and Stalin do not get along with the way that Truman and FDR got along. Their relationship is much more tense. There's a lot of bitterness between the United States and the Soviet Union, and we've kind of started making that list why. Stalin wants extreme harsh punishment, particularly for Germany. And Churchill really disagrees. Truman tries to mediate them. And so there's a lot of questions about really what to do. What we end up deciding, mainly kind of to keep the peace with Stalin, is, and this is after the war has ended in Europe. The war has not ended in Japan when this meeting takes place. Stalin says that we need him in the Pacific Theater. He agrees to help out. Stalin agrees to join the UN and to make it a success. And this is all before the dropping of the atomic bomb. So all of this is done prior to the war ending in Japan. We will come back to these. I'm sort of going to skip them. The Nuremberg trials are the trials for the top SS officials that were related to the Holocaust. 12 of the top 24 are sentenced to death. The rest get life in prison. 200 more Nazis go to trial. What they try to prove, or they try to use as a defense, is that they weren't guilty because they were following orders of their commander. And the trial proves that you are not exempt from crimes against humanity simply by saying I was following orders. But no matter what, you know right from wrong, and you shouldn't have done it. Action in Japan, we sort of mentioned that. We occupied Japan for 7 years. We put in massive changes as well. There are people arrested. There are people sent to death. We free people from POW camps. This is General Douglas MacArthur, who is put in charge of Japan. He will later be pulled for that when we go to war with Korea shortly after. So that ends our talk of World War II. Please make sure that you are reading AMSCO. Please make sure that you're paying attention to PowerPoints. Make sure that you have taken copious notes. And look at that, finished it in less than 15 minutes.